You join me here today on the banks of the River Lee, and I'm having a short little afternoon and evening sessions perch fishing. I'm often asked what method, what tackle, what rods and reels and braid that I use to catch these big perch. So I thought today I'll spend some time going through the tackle and the tactics that I use to catch all my big perch. Starting with my rod and reel setup, I often opt for a nice 1.5 pound test curve rod. I often go for a 1.5 pound because you've got a nice bit of backbone, especially when you're fishing for perch. Their mouths are pretty bony, so when you're sort of setting hooks, I like to have that stiffness. I use a 12-footer most of the time, especially on rivers. When you're trotting a float, it's nice to be able to mend your braid and be in control with your float and setup at all times. I've got a small 3000 size reel, and loaded on the spool I've got 15-pound braided mainline. Nice and strong, you don't lose much mainline, tough enough to handle big pike. I've had pike landed to nearly 30 pounds on this setup, so it's surprising what you can land. So yeah, plenty strong enough, and the perfect light outfit for all-round big perch fishing. There's two setups that I use when I'm bait fishing for big perch. One's a paternoster setup, more of a static setup, where your bait's in position and it's not really moving. When you find maybe the perch sold up, or you're fishing up to some structure, maybe a boat, on a drop off, or up to a tree or a snag, it's a great method to present your bait, knowing that your bait's not moving and drifting away from the fish. First off, I start with a couple of overhand slip knots on the braid. It's a nice small neat knot that the float can buff up to, and I prefer to use a slip knot rather than float stops, just because you can reel the slip knot through the eyes of the rod, especially if you're fishing in deeper water. Sometimes it's nice and smoother going through the rod rings. So a couple of slip knots. I then have a bright coloured bead, a different colour to my float generally. This one's yellow, and then my float, just so you know that you're fishing presented and cocked when the float's buffed up to that bead. After I slide them up, I then slide a single float stop along with a swivel on the line that your lead link attaches to, and a buffer bead and another swivel on the end of your braid. This forms a helicopter-like setup, and your bait will rotate around the line and not come into contact with the bottom or any snags, as long as you fish your hook link. This one's just over half the length of my lead link, but around halfway is perfect. 10-pound fluorocarbon for my hook link, and a weaker link of 6-pound line for the lead link, just in case it does get caught in any debris on the bottom. A nice simple setup, and with the lead link running on the line, when you get a bite from a perch, the float's more free running up to that float stop, so there's less resistance on the fish when it picks up your bait. Nice, simple, effective way of fishing a static bait in position. The way the paternoster works is that once your lead's in position on the bottom and you've found your depth and the float's cocked, that with your hook link being shorter than your lead link, your bait is literally just rotating and your bait's in position, not moving. Like I said, it's great for fishing up against snags, any structure, and when you locate a shoal of perch, to have your rod in position and it's not wandering off downstream if you're fishing the rivers, and it's always fishing effectively for you. It very, very rarely tangles, and it's a great effective way of fishing static baits. The second setup that I use, and it is a really great fun setup to use when you're searching a lot of water, is a simple slide and float setup. Along the braid is the exact same setup that I had before on the Paternoster. A couple of slip knots on the line to adjust your depth, a small bead and your slide and float. Behind that is a float stop, then your required ball weight to cock your float, and a small buffer bead and your 10-pound hook link. If I know there's not a lot of pike present, I will maybe drop down to 6-pound fluorocarbon instead of 10, but along the lee here you sometimes get a few pike, so it's often that I'll use a little bit heavier just to when it's very cold and wet, not have to tie loads of hook links when I'm on the bank. Down to the hook, on both Paternoster and slide and float setups, I use a size 4 or size 6 carp hook in a wide gape style pattern, just to adjust sort of bait size or adjust hook size regarding what size bait I'm using. But a nice simple setup. This is great for trotting along the river, alongside boats, around locks, and covering a lot of water. The Paternoster setups are great, but often I'll use them when I'm sort of fishing somewhere and fishing more statically against structure and not really moving too much. But one rod and a net is sometimes all you need when you're just doing a short evening session and using the roving float setup to locate some fish. One quick touch up on fish safety: whenever I'm fixing a ball weight or a lead weight on the Paternoster setup, above it I will always use a float stop or a stop knot that can slide away. If your lead gets snagged or your line snaps above the float, you know that that fish can pull away if he gets in a snag, and that float stop will slide away and the fish won't be tethered against any kind of weight that's fixed in position. So I'd never fix it with a swivel, always something that can free move and has a bit of give if the fish ever gets snagged up. A quick run through my tackle box: a small Drennan Specialist hard case. Inside it I have minimal, just what I need for my day's fishing. My float stops and swivels and buffer beads, a couple of spools of hook link, some spare floats, and in this top pouch here I have some lead link, probably too many leads for what I need. I've got about 10 leads in there, little 1.5 ounces for my Paternoster setups. Some more drop shot fluorocarbon, and yeah, a nice light simple tackle box. That's all I need for my day's perch fishing. I take that, my small little Specialist unhooking mat, and a small net and a couple of rods. That's all you need. Nice and light, and you can cover lots of water, and it's nice and forgiving on the back as well. I've had a little walk along the river and there's not too much structure, and further up I've located a few trees and snags where there may be some perch hiding. So what I'm going to do this evening is drop a couple of Paternosters in that area and sit tight and hope for a few nice perch to turn up. You'll often find the perch will be held up around snags and structure this time of year, because the bait fish will be hiding in them kind of locations. So going to give it the evening's fishing there and see what turns up. I'm just setting up my Paternoster rod, and in my near margin I've got a little bit of structure. So I'm going to tie my lead on, work out the depth and go from there. I'm probably going to fish the static Paternoster up against that structure. Looks really good down there, and maybe use my roving rod in and around some of these overhanging bushes on the far side. real big frame fish, and it is a freezing January evening. The last light bite. Perfect perch.